All right, thanks for having me and thanks for sticking around. So this has been fun because hopefully what some of this conversation about gender and media does is pick up on some of the types of media and dynamics of media that have already been talked about on this panel. So despite some claims or hope that the presence of women in both major party primaries signaled a gender-neutral or bias-free environment, the 2016 election has already provided plenty of evidence that campaigns, I would argue, are still gender-drained, and media of all types provide windows into the ways in which campaigns remain gendered, from coverage and commentary from journalists and pundits, to campaign strategies and technologies meant to manipulate media and use media to reach particular voters, particularly women. So I want to start with an example. In a September interview with Rolling Stone, Donald Trump criticized Carly Fiorina's looks, telling the writer, "Look at that face, would anyone vote for that? Can you imagine that, the face of our next president?" And you've probably all seen this because of the media coverage. But Donald Trump is not the only one who's commented on Carly Fiorina's face. After the second GOP debate, multiple commentators criticized her for not smiling enough. And then after the third debate, the ladies of The View said that her smile in the debate made her appear demented. This is supplemented by the more blatant critiques of Fiorina's appearance all over the internet. So these are just some select tweets, and you could find many more of these, and then news coverage about if she got Botox or should get Botox. In one way, this exemplifies continued attention to and policing of women's appearance, women candidates' appearances. This is not new. Just ask Hillary Clinton. But the reaction by Fiorina and others to these comments reflects, I think, the changing media and gender environment. For example, within 24 hours of when Trump's initial comment from Rolling Stone was released, Fiorina responded on the campaign trail and in TV interviews. That response went viral when Carly PAC created a web ad almost immediately using her voice over the face of a diverse group of women talking about being proud of your face as a woman, etc. This targeted women, but it also energized many women. And I can say it was on my Facebook feed for days, right? So there was a lot of virality in terms of this video. Energized women to come to her side. Then, when The View called her looks demented, another media commentator, CNN's Brooke Baldwin, called them out for double standards, eliciting a much larger response than would have been amongst just those folks who watched The View that day, right? So it became a bigger news story. And finally, Fiorina aligned with women in the media when they began a line of tweets to confront Donald Trump's sexist attacks. So you can't see the very top, but the first tweet was from a Fox commentator who was attacked by Trump. That then led to a conversation with Meghan McCain, who brought Megyn Kelly into the conversation, and then Carly Fiorina jumps in and says, sure, we should all basically have a party. So you start to create these relationships between journalists and candidates. I think that this demonstrates the way that media, particularly new media, has changed campaign coverage, engagement, and strategy, and the relationship between them. Media is, in this scenario, both the problem and the solution, particularly when it comes to replicating or disrupting gender stereotypes, or promoting or combating sexism, whether it's explicit or implicit. So what do we know to date in terms of the research? And my colleagues have touched on a lot of this, but in terms of gender in media, what we know is that much of the research on gender media and campaigns evaluates the extent to which men and women candidates are covered differently in quantity or quality. Work on this from the early 1990s would say that women were covered less, covered more negatively, and that different trend or pattern of coverage had negative effects on candidate or voter evaluations of candidates. But we've seen some variance in the robustness of these findings over time. For example, in recent studies, we see very little difference in the quantity of coverage of men or women candidates. But differences in framing, focus, and tone of coverage are still evident in many, though not all, studies of gender differences in media. Put simply, the most persistent findings show that coverage of female candidates, more often than men's coverage, focuses on traits, personality, appearance, the novelty of them being a woman candidate, over issue coverage. Or even more simply, we talk about this as coverage of hair, hemlines, and husbands. So the bias in coverage, we also know, has implications for women's ability to be taken seriously as candidates and to prove the credentials that they need for the job, which are more often doubted for women candidates because they, despite much progress in politics, remain apart from the norm, right? You're still the outsider to the system. So more research is needed to understand how and the extent to which gender bias in media coverage informs voter evaluations and stereotypical expectations. In terms of what was said earlier, I think this is a different effect to look for, right? It's not even what to think or what to think about, but how voters think about these things. So are they informed by a sort of gender filter through which we see candidates or we see the media coverage of them? And that research needs to better address some limitations, especially within this modern campaign age. So I want to point to two limitations. So first, what counts as media? And I think we sort of gloss over this a lot of the time because we just use media very broadly. Some of the variance in findings on gender bias are due to the types of media that are included in the study. So most studies, for example, exclude cable media, but this is where we often see the most overt examples of gender bias and gendered commentary, and I could present some great clips of that from folks like Bill O'Reilly or Chris Matthews or Rush Limbaugh, among others. Similarly, studies often exclude editorial coverage because of the assumption of bias, right? It is inherently biased. However, again, that's where we see some perpetuation of gender stereotypes. Few studies also evaluate alternative types of media. It's harder to study these types. For example, editorial cartoons are hard to code, but they often provide some of the most explicit gendered tropes. So these are we have a whole library of these from the 2008 campaign of Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin in particular. Just to point to a few themes here, right? So what we see in some of these are Hillary Clinton as sort of infantilized in a booster seat. Her experience is not her own, but is of her male partner, of her husband. She might be too emotional or too weak to handle international pressures. She might go crazy, which is a trope often used against women. And finally, on the sort of flip side, the idea that women's power or women's empowerment comes at the cost of men, that her power is emasculating. And there's actually a whole series of editorial cartoons with Hillary Clinton and a whip, which goes into this whole trope of sexuality and again, women's power. So some of the most overt biases we see in this type of media, but it's harder to measure and we often don't measure it, and in a way that I think is actually pretty important. Another example, right, is new media and social media, as we've talked about. It's a new frontier for evaluating media coverage and the potential for bias. So while new forms of media provide new ways for women candidates to communicate their messages and to target their messages and combat bias or sexism like we saw with the Fiorina example, they also open the door to even more bias. So I'm just using a personal example here. So when I tweeted after a GOP debate about the sort of mansplaining done by Brit Hume on Fox News in support of Megyn Kelly, immediately I was trolled with somebody who told me I should stick to making sandwiches. That sort of gender dialogue is apparent all over the internet, and to any sort of women or folks advocating against gender bias or sexism, and it happens really frequently and sort of with great virality. The question is, how important is that, right? Should we pay attention? Should we care that this guy wants me to go back to the kitchen or not? Maybe not, right? This gets into the measure of what media we use and what we think ultimately has an effect on our larger conversation in politics and campaigns. So a question here, are there any types of media that are more influential or important to candidates and campaigns than others, whether in influencing strategy, voter perceptions, or electoral outcomes? And how do you account for the echo chamber, right, or how viral these sorts of messages go on social media in that estimation or calculation of effects? And so even if there's fewer viewers of cable news, if they see it and it's repeated in social media, they see clips or they hear commentary, doesn't that still need to be counted, especially if we're talking about the ways in which gender bias persists? The second question I repeatedly have is sort of, how do you define bias? And particularly here I'm talking about gender bias. So how do you measure it? Is it in quantity? Is it in quality or framing? What counts as bias and what doesn't, which is often a question even amongst the candidates themselves. And does bias look or act the same way when targeting men versus women candidates? And I had a whole series of slides here, but I'll just give one example. So the coverage of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been largely about how hot he is, right, and his appearance. Does that coverage have the same effect as appearance coverage of women candidates? And I would put out there that in some ways sexualizing men, while not positive, does evoke masculinity expected of office holding. The idea that you are still manly enough for the job. But sexualizing women evokes tropes of femininity that are not still associated with leadership, strength, independence, and the seriousness expected of candidates, particularly at the presidential level. So that similar types of coverage or bias coverage may actually yield different effects. So while the evolving media environment provides new and multiple points of entry and engagement that I think can aggravate and complicate the problems of gender bias, I do want to end with how the double-edged nature of this media also means that there are new sites or routes for potential solutions for candidates, feminist advocates, and scholars to challenge underlying gender dynamics that may work to women's disadvantage in what is still a masculine arena of political campaigns. So I'm ending with a couple of potential solutions. One, campaigns can deal with or confront gender bias directly. Lake Research Partners has done some research on sexism and shown that when women candidates call it out, or even better, have a third party call it out for them, then the negative effects of that sexist coverage can be overturned. But campaigns can also try to heat off gendered coverage before it even starts. And I think this gets to Daniel's point about the campaigns really using, in this case, social media to influence journalists more than anybody else. So you see Hillary Clinton as one of her first Instagram post posting about her pantsuits and which pantsuit she's going to wear to her first major campaign event. She owns the narrative if she puts it out first. Right? And so she's tried to use both humor and sort of ownership of appearance coverage in a way to control it. She's done this too with talking about her hair. So you've all heard the line, especially here in Iowa, probably many times, that she won't have gray hair in the White House because she's the only candidate who will dye her hair. She's also compared coverage of her hair to coverage of Trump's hair. Again, controlling that narrative that may be negative against her. Another thing that she's talked about, or in this case Bill Clinton has talked about, is sort of heating off the discussion that was really prominent in 2008 about the co-candidacy between them. And so she said things like, I'm running for my first term, not the third term of Bill or Barack. And then most recently, President Clinton said, I'm tired of the stranglehold that women have had on the job of presidential spouse, sort of reaffirming that he's going to be in this secondary role despite arguments to the contrary. Outside third parties can also use social media to confront the bias, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that we're doing at the center, but also in the most recent debate, a group called Misrepresentation has put forth their hashtag #AskHerMore that they've used for the Oscars and Grammys and things like that to try to apply them to political debates to call out bias. And finally, campaigns can use social media, especially for this targeting, so that they're not only evoking gender solidarity against sort of oppression or bias, but that they're bringing up things that might evoke solidarity for women in terms of the excitement or advantage of having a woman in the White House. Another potential solution, maybe we should have more women in the media. And so I could go through all the statistics, but I won't. But just to say that women are highly underrepresented, both as news directors and bylines and on camera. So if we have more women's voices in the media, does that necessarily mean it's less bias? We need to examine that, and we need more women in media to see if that's true. This is Hillary Clinton's press pool, highly female, and so the implications of that are going to be interesting. Finally, the last piece, and this is something I'm particularly excited about. I think that scholars, particularly those of us in the room, don't only have a responsibility to analyze the media, but also to try to contribute to it in a way that elevates the dialogue and can educate, where necessary, the media. So it's easy to criticize them, but we play a role in making them more responsible and more in tune with what we know. So the rise of new media makes this even more possible. At the center, we started a project called Presidential Gender Watch 2016. This is a website. It's also on social media, on Twitter and Facebook, where we curate the news on a daily basis that looks at sort of the gender lens through which we can evaluate what's happening in the presidential race and the coverage of it. It's not meant to be a sort of sexism watch in any way, but we try to provide a research angle to what's happening. So when we see coverage that may be biased, we demonstrate and talk about why it might matter. Let me give you one example and then I'll wrap up. So we were watching the first Democratic debate, and after that debate, Dana Milbank of the Washington Post wrote a glowing review of Hillary Clinton's performance in which he called her a man among boys. And thinking he was doing a positive thing, he did not realize that he would have a fairly swift social media response in a negative way. From folks like Gender Watch 2016 and from prominent media folks like Soledad O'Brien, who wrote WTF, sigh, why would you do this, right? We then proceeded to write an analysis about that. Why was that problematic? More than the sort of just saying WTF, explain why perpetuating the idea that being a man equals success, that women have to adapt to a model of male success is problematic. We then used that to write and explain using the research that we knew. We then tweeted it back at Soledad O'Brien, who then shared it with her communities. And ultimately, Dana Milbank actually went back and changed the language in his article to a woman among boys. So that's one small example, but one way in which we do have some influence in the dialogue, in the media dialogue, and I think is a potential solution, at least for the conversation about eliminating or at least reducing or calling out gender bias. Thanks.